I'm Noel Lateef, President of the Foreign Policy Association, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this Whitehead Fellows reception and talk. We have styled it a Whitehead Fellows talk because the author is very young and fits the category of the mold of our Whitehead Fellows, young future leaders of this country. And I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge Enzo Viscusi, who has very graciously hosted this reception and made it possible. Enzo. We thought it would be appropriate to have a Whitehead Fellow do the formal introduction, so I'm going, without further ado, to turn the microphone over to Evan Ulick, one of the leaders, within the leaders of the Whitehead Fellows. Evan?
Thank you, Noel, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Evan Ulick, and I'm a John C. Whitehead Fellow here at the Foreign Policy Association. And also just want to thank Mr. Whitehead for joining us tonight. His sponsorship of the program is extremely valuable. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Evan.
It's really my great pleasure this evening to welcome you all to this special Whitehead reception and book signing in honor of our guest, Nicholas Thompson, who will be speaking on his new book, The Hawk and the Dove, Paul Nitze and George Kennan and the History of the Cold War. The Hawk and the Dove is a dual biography on Nitze and Kennan, and was released this fall to essentially universal acclaim for its candid and insightful portrayal of two men whose thoughts and ideals really drove the United States' foreign policy during the Cold War. What are the contributing factors to this outstanding success, you might ask? Well, other than being obviously a highly talented and professional journalist, it's worth pointing out that Mr. Thompson is in fact the grandson of Paul Nitze, which I find remarkable. And this book really reflects his personal connection with one of the story's main protagonists. The family dynamic, in part, allowed him to do over 150 interviews, many of which with former Cold Warriors, as well as access voluminous political and family records. What I find so striking about the book, and in particular the interface between these two wise and passionate men, was the civil and kind of gracious political discourse they achieved despite the obvious kind of grave and complicated issues that often brought these two men to loggerheads. In short, despite their differing approach to the United States' relationship with the USSR, as the title of the book infers, Nitze and Kennan achieved a mutual respect, admiration, and friendship that in today's intensely partisan and contentious governmental atmosphere I find to be enlightening and something we can all strive to achieve. Brief word about the author. Nicholas Thompson grew up in New York City and is currently a senior editor at Wired magazine, a contributing editor at Bloomberg Television, and an official panelist on CNN International's Connect the World. Prior to his current role, Mr. Thompson was a senior editor at Legal Affairs, an editor at the Washington Monthly. As a thoughtful and established writer on politics, law, and technology for numerous publications, including the New York Times Book Review, he has also become a fixture on major cable and news broadcast networks. I might also add, for a touch of personal color, that he is an accomplished acoustic guitarist and has made 3 albums so far. I actually listened to some of your stuff this afternoon. So on behalf of the Foreign Policy Association, we are indeed very grateful for your comments. Thank you.
say that my time as a guitarist was spent a lot in clubs in New York City, but also a lot in the subway stations. I'd say I have never, the background in the setting was quite different than what we have here at the Century. Anyway, thank you, Evan, that was very nice. Thank you, Noel. Thank you to the Whitehead Fellowship Program. Thank you to Enzo for setting this up. Thank you to the Foreign Policy Association. Delighted to be here. And also thank you for mentioning that Nitze is my grandfather. One of my favorite moments in one of the talk I gave a couple months ago. And right at the beginning, when I stand up and start to talk, somebody puffs out. My host was at the door and says, what's wrong? He says, I thought we were going to hear Nietzsche's grandson. I think that. And I also want to, Evan mentioned the civility. I want to start the talk with the civility between Nitze and Kennan, which is one of the things that interested me the most when I was beginning this project. The project began in 1999, where my grandfather was living in Georgetown. My grandfather's Nitze. He's the hawk. He's the man who throughout his life says, we need more weapons. Right? We're trailing the Soviet Union weapons. We need to catch them. If we're ahead, we need to be really far ahead. And if we're even, we need to move ahead. So his whole life, pushing American weapons building. More of this, more of that. No one knows more about how to calibrate the arsenals. No one understands where exactly you can use SLBM. So that's my grandfather's life. That's what he does. That's the central thing. Kennan is the dove, says, we don't need these things at all. In 1999, my grandfather converts. The Cold War is over, and he writes an op-ed in the New York Times. He goes, look, the Cold War's over. We don't need these things anymore. There's no conflict where we would use them. So he writes this op-ed in the Times. So I was at his house, maybe 10 days after the op-ed ran, and he gets a letter. We're having dinner, and elegant affair. My grandfather's a very stately, elegant man. And he says after dinner that he wants to read a letter. So he stands up, his gravelly voice, his distinguished white beard. It's from an old friend of his. And the letter says, Dear Paul, I read today your op-ed in the New York Times, and I must say I agree with every word. The exact phrase, but isn't it lovely that after 50 years we finally find ourselves in accord on matters that have meant so much to us in times gone by? And your friend George. That's this incredible letter. I mean, it's so elegant, it's so beautiful, and I suddenly realized then, that was the first moment it struck me, these men have been arguing for 50 years? At the end, I asked my grandfather about it. He says something cryptic about George. Yes, they're always right. Is that a compliment? Is that, and so that was when the seed was planted for this book. 5 years later, my grandfather dies. Shortly thereafter, Kennan dies. And I said, okay, I'm going to begin this project. I'm going to investigate their lives. I'm going to look at this relationship. They're the only two men who were there from the beginning of the Cold War. So yeah, they represent polar opposite views. They're very different. They fight over all the major issues. They genuinely believe that if America follows the other's foreign policy, the world will blow up. They both believe that deep down as far as you can believe, and yet they're friends. So that was the premise for the book, and that's where I began 5 years ago. All right. So the idea of the book, it's not a biography. It's not the psychohistory of Paul Nitze or the psychology of George Kennan or how Nitze's youth in Chicago shaped his worldview. There's a little bit about that. You want to understand the characters, but it's really a history of the Cold War. But it's a history of the Cold War told through people, right? Most histories of the Cold War are outside. Here's Korea. Here's what happened in Korea. Here's what we got in. Here's what went wrong. Here's Vietnam. Here's the arms negotiations. At the side, one episode, then the next, then the next. Almost every history of the Cold War is written that way because that's the way to do it. Except I figured I could do it through people. So the story is now here's the Korean War, and here's what Nitze was saying. Here's what Kennan was saying. Here's what they were doing. Here's Vietnam. Here's what Nitze was saying. Here's what Kennan was doing. So the idea isn't to tell you everything about Nitze's life or Kennan's life. It's to tell you as much as you can about the Cold War through these two people. So it begins in 1945. And there's Kennan. He's the ranking American in the embassy in Moscow. He's standing in Red Square. We've just been allied with the Russians. We just defeated the Germans with them. Everybody outside is celebrating. There's incredible excitement in the streets. This is the very beginning of the book, May 1945. Kennan, he's very shy, sort of frail. He's very nervous. He's worried that if he goes out to the crowd, tossed on people's shoulders, he can't countenance that. And he's thinking, he had served in Moscow under Stalin in the 1930s. He'd seen the purges. He knows what this government is like. So he knows that that maybe things look good. Maybe we're excited about being their friends right now, but that's not going to last. Things will turn. Things will go badly. And so he's looking out in the crowd and sort of pity. Right? These people are celebrating. They don't know what's coming. So he's trying to decide what to do. So the opening scene of the book is him standing there with his daughter Joan, trying to figure out what should I do. And she's throwing candy down and she's excited. He finally decides to step out and say something very quick and go back inside. And at the same time, Nitze, my grandfather, he's just rising up. He'd been working on Wall Street. He'd been a banker. He joined the government during the war, right before the war got started, right before the U.S. got in. And now he's working on something called the Strategic Bombing Service. So that same day, his job is to go to Germany. He speaks German. He's going to interview the Nazi leaders. His first job, the first really important thing he does is to interview Albert Speer. And so that's where the book begins. Kennan standing in Moscow, Nitze flying to Germany to interview Speer. And that's the beginning of their lives and of this incredible story. So I'm going to read a couple of short passages from the book. And I often read about sort of the most important political events, but today I'm going to read more about them as people because last night when I was thinking a lot about the book, and it's been almost a year since I finished the last copy of it. So it's been a year since I've gotten to engage with these two men. It's been a year since I read something new that Kennan wrote, a new letter. It's been a year since I've been in these archives, and I realized how much I miss these two guys. As I hope will become clear by the end of this, these are two extraordinary human beings. There is nothing like the rigor that George Kennan brings to everything he does, everything he writes. It's just beautiful. The clarity and precision, the way he thinks and what he does. And my grandfather, the energy he brings and his ability to get up when he's knocked down. And he's spending 4 years with these people is sort of an intense experience to constantly be thinking about them and have them looking over your shoulder as you research. And obviously, as a grandson, it's doubly intense because it's not just a character you're distant from, it's somebody you knew as a child. So today I'm going to read, slightly balance this towards the personal because how strong. I mean, obviously, they both did some things I disagree with. I criticized both of them partially throughout the book at different moments. My grandfather was profoundly wrong at times. Kennan, I think, was profoundly wrong on certain issues, but both intensely admirable people. And a year apart from them, it's made me miss them. All right. 41 years old in the spring of 1945, George Frost Kennan stood about 6 feet tall. He dressed in a gray or black three-piece suit, wore a felt fedora, and stood straight. He'd already lost much of his hair, which helped give him a dignified and weathered look. When deep in contemplation, which was most of the time, he would draw his eyebrows together narrowly. The features everyone noticed first were his eyes, a bright but pale blue. To many friends, an index of the intensity of the thought behind them. He liked to take long walks through the countryside, and he liked to sketch, always in black and white because he was colorblind. Everything in his life was ordered and neat. He kept every tool he owned in exactly the right place, and always wrote his thank you notes on Christmas Day. He enjoyed making things with his hands, and he loved telling stories to his daughter Joan, their 9-year-old daughter, on the balcony. At night, he would regale her with tales about 2 pixies named Tim and Belle, and a droopy-eared cocker spaniel, Uncle Zachariah. He made up these stories as he went, always ended in a way that made her want to hear more. He felt deeply. He observed deeply. He saw every event as an opportunity to train his mind. Disciplined in the extreme, he believed that outward order, created by staying in control of his actions and his attire, could offset inner turmoil. And of the latter, there was much. Kennan despaired for his country, for himself. To his friends, he appeared perpetually worried. Throughout his life, he kept a dark and somber diary, entering in a world of literary self-flagellation, even on days when he appeared cheery. When traveling alone, instead of calling ahead to find a good restaurant, he'd wait until the last minute, rush out to the most miserable-looking place in the neighborhood, and then complain about the food. Nitze stood a wiry 5'9" and 3/4. What everyone noticed first was the intensity, the pencil ripping through paper as he took notes, the constant motion, the desire to break every problem apart and reassemble it as a series of neatly ordered lists. He grasped concepts quickly. He gave orders well and carried them out exactly. He would stay up late, talking, eating, and drinking, but then get up at 4 a.m. to read. He delighted in the origin of his last name. Nitze, he liked to assert, comes from the same root as the Greek word Nike, and the Greek word Nike means victory. It's not true, by the way, he said. He dressed with haste, but always in a fine suit, and often in elegant suspenders. Although he was perpetually rumpled, he gave the impression of a man with excellent taste who had more important things on his mind. A burglar once cleaned out his closet and passed out everything else in the house. But at home, in the 1940s, When at home, he would begin his days by practicing Bach on the piano. After work, he would return and mix a martini for himself, judging the gin and vermouth ratio according to, he claimed, a finely calibrated sense of sound. He loved to meet new people. PHN collects people, his wife wrote, as some collect butterflies. So that's 1945. They're both right. Kennan will leave the Moscow. Kennan will stay in the Moscow embassy, and then in February of '46, Stalin gives a very aggressive speech at the Bolshoi. Kennan has been, since the end of the war, has been writing these memos about Soviet malfeasance and why we'll never get along and why, our friendship with Stalin is a chimera. Over and over, he's sending these memos. February '46, Stalin gives the speech. State Department cables to Kennan, hey, why did Stalin give this harsh speech? Kennan says, my gosh, they've asked for it, now they're going to get it. He sits, talks to the secretary, dictates this 5,000-word memo, which becomes the long telegram. The document that explains why Stalin will never be our friend. He sends it, thinks it will have no influence, and of course it turns out that everybody reads it in Washington, transforms the way we think about the Soviet Union, and turns George Kennan into somebody whose name everybody knows. One of my favorite stories, while researching this book, Evan mentioned that I interviewed 150 people. One of my favorites was, I was desperate to find somebody who had known Kennan at this time, who served in the embassy. I finally found one, this old woman named Martha Mocker. And I go to her house and she's got a cane and a hip operation. And I sit down and, Miss Mocker, I'm trying to recreate the scene of Kennan in the long telegram. Do you remember anything about it? Anything at all? And she says, oh, yes, I tried to stop it. And it turns out that she'd been working in the code room when he came down with his long memo and had a date that evening and had no interest in typing it in and said, we don't need to send this, they've read it all before. Kennan sends a long telegram, becomes famous, he's summoned back to Washington, suddenly he becomes the man everybody wants to listen to. He then becomes head of the policy planning staff, so his job is to come up with our policy plans. So Kennan rises quickly, becomes very important. Nitze leaves Germany, goes to Hiroshima, was one of the first Americans to analyze the effects of the atomic bomb. But his rise is a little more slow. It takes him a little while longer to get going. But finally in 1949, he works on the Marshall Plan. Kennan comes up with some of the main concepts behind the Marshall Plan, how we should structure it, how we should do this, how it should work. Nitze argues for it in Congress. So their lives start to intersect there. Kennan realizes Nitze has a good reputation. And so in 1949, Kennan, who's head of the policy planning staff, brings Nitze on as his deputy. And so this is where Nitze really becomes a person of prominence. I'm going to read a short passage here about their rivalry with Dean Acheson, because Acheson is Secretary of State at the time, and obviously a very important person at this time in American foreign policy. And he's crucial to Nitze and Kennan because he's an early mentor to both of them, and then he clashes with Kennan. He and Kennan have sort of a fierce split. And he and Nitze remain extremely close. At the beginning, he's closer to Kennan, and then he becomes much closer to Nitze. Intellectually, Acheson seemed closer to Kennan than to Nitze. This is early 1949. They wrote some of the sharpest letters in Washington, and both were capable of thinking strategically. Kennan went out of his way to appeal to Acheson's intellectual side. 2 weeks before Acheson's swearing in, Kennan sent him a long memo on the problems of confronting them and the magnitude of the changes needed. It began, I really have no enthusiasm for sharing with people I have known, Kerensky, Dumbar, the king of Yugoslavia, the wretched consolation of having been particularly prominent among the parasites on the body of the dying social order in the hours of its final agony. Great sentence. Nitze never wrote a sentence that vivid in his life, nor was he intellectually at Kennan's or Acheson's level. He had yet to attain real responsibility or have written anything that attracted the attention of the people who mattered. He was still a numbers man, a smart one, but his temperament suited Acheson. The secretary liked to quote Oliver Wendell Holmes' line that man is born to act, a maxim that fit Nitze, even at this early stage. Nitze would later describe Acheson's fascination with the book by Clarence Day that Holmes had given him, The Simian World. The author argued that people are monkeys. Yes, we can think. This separates us from other animals. We're not going to find answers in the endless quest for truth. Instead, we should just accept who we are, do the best we can, and not try to live up to unreachable ideals and values. Reflecting on this book, Nitze recalled a poem reader he had seen in college. She, quote, opened my hand and stared at it for 5 minutes, saying not a word. When she finally spoke, she said, I can say nothing about this man. He has a purely practical hand. So that's Nitze, the purely practical man, Kennan, the dreamer, the big thinker. And they work well together. In some ways, they're a perfect partnership. Nitze Nitze can run the numbers, he can work out the details, Kennan can think of the big thoughts. So for a brief period, Nitze deputy, Kennan is head of the policy planning staff, everything is great, works perfectly. And then the moment comes when they completely split apart. And that's August 1949. Soviet Union sets off an atomic bomb. The United States finds out September 49. We have to figure out what to do about that. And so Truman says, Atchison, what should we do? Atchison says, hold on, Nitze and Kennan, what should we do? And the question is, should we build a hydrogen bomb? That's the main question on the table that fall. And so Nitze and Kennan say, okay, we'll think about this. And what happens in this moment is they both set the patterns they're going to follow for the rest of their lives, intellectually and professionally. Kennan decides he's going to sort of disappear, goes into the Library of Congress, into a small office, and he writes, and he thinks. And he comes out at the end of December of 49 with this amazing paper, 79 pages, beautiful issue. He quotes Shakespeare, quotes the Bible, wonderful little history of St. Paul, and foresees everything. Right? If we build a hydrogen bomb, then the Soviets will follow. And then what will happen? Well, we'll build more, and they will build more, and then we'll begin this destructive arms race. And eventually we'll be unable to think clearly about foreign policy because we'll all have so many weapons that will just dominate everything. Everything he says, pretty much right. But it's completely and totally useless because who is going to read a 79-page paper in the heat of this incredibly quick and fast debate? Nitze, meanwhile, says, okay, wait, it's a little simpler. Are the Soviets going to try to build a hydrogen bomb? Yes. If we succeed and build a hydrogen bomb, will that be bad? Yes. If we build a hydrogen bomb before they build one, will that be good? Yes. So let's build one. And he takes this very simple syllogism and he convinces people in the State Department. He argues here, he argues there. He shuts this person out of the conversation, pulls this person in, pushes this scientist aside, brings in this scientist. And at the end, Nitze ends up having real sway on Atchison. Atchison ends up deciding that we should build a hydrogen bomb, and Truman follows the lead. So Kennan is brilliant, decisive, beautiful, wonderful, and not effective. Nitze is much simpler, sharper, works the bureaucracy as best he can, and succeeds. And so that's the pattern of their lives. From then on, Kennan will become the big thinker, the dreamer, the man who writes these incredible books on American foreign policy. There are no better books about the early Cold War than Kennan's memoirs. These incisive, these wonderful speeches, his early testimony of Vietnam is the clearest, smartest thing about Vietnam. His essays on the arms race are amazing. Everything he writes will be beautiful, will be clear, will be interesting, and will be generally ineffective. Nitze won't write anything remotely like Kennan, but he'll be there in the bureaucracy. He'll work for every president, from Roosevelt to Bush. When he's knocked down, he'll get back up. He's actually, despite working for these 10 presidents, he is fired or demoted by Roosevelt, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, and Bush. So a pretty good record of, at one point or another, having his career disrupted by everybody except for Reagan and Truman. But every time he's knocked down, he gets back up. And in fact, what he really does, as his grandson, I'm proud of this, but maybe I shouldn't be, is the first thing he does whenever he's fired by somebody is go off the record and kick them in the shins. And then the second thing he does is start trying to rebuild his career. Even when he's fired by Bush, when he's 83 years old, sort of squeezed out, and given a job with no portfolio, the first thing he does is give a series of off-the-record interviews slamming the president and James Baker. And the day after he leaves, there's a front-page story in the New York Times criticizing the Bush administration's approach to arms control. So there he is, 83 years old, still punching his enemies in the stomach. All right, so that's my grandfather. I want to read a couple of short things from Kennan just to get across the flavor of his writing, thinking, and a little bit of his political philosophy. The first is a somewhat famous passage, which is one of my favorite metaphors in the history of American foreign policy. This is from the 1950s, where Kennan is giving a series of lectures in Chicago in the spring of 1950, spring of 1951. And the central precept of Kennan's political philosophy is realism. It's the notion that the United States should not engage in world affairs because when we do, we generally mess it up. He believes that, he wouldn't say he believes in realism. There's some times where he differs from that, but that is essentially the most coherent strand that runs through Kennan's thought from the early days to the very end. So this is what he says about American democracy. I sometimes wonder in this respect whether democracy is not uncomfortably similar to one of those prehistoric monsters with a body as long as this room and a brain the size of a pin. He lies there in his comfortable primeval mud, pays little attention to his environment. He is slow to wrath. In fact, you practically have to whack his tail off to make him aware that his interests are being disturbed. Once he grasps this, he lays about him with such blind determination that he not only destroys his adversary, but largely wrecks his native habitat. That's Kennan on American foreign policy. And then here's another, this is a passage from his diary in November 1956, where 3 things have happened that pain him. First, Stevenson has lost the election. Secondly, the Hungarian freedom fighters who have started an uprising have been crushed. And third, the United States has failed to back up the British and French in the Suez Canal crisis. So Kennan is just despairing for all 3. I could quote 50 such passages at different points in his diary, but this gets across a little bit of the man, both the rigor of his writing, even in his private diary entries, and the despair he sometimes felt. The events of these recent days have been so shattering that I'm at a loss to know how to react to them personally. If war comes, as it probably will, I had best seek a military commission and serve wherever I am asked to serve. I shall probably not survive it. One rarely survives 2 world wars in responsible public service. Nor will it make much difference what I do. For a government so unable to use serious counsel in a time of peace will scarcely be able to make better use of it in a time of war. But by holding a commission, I shall give my family a better break in a country which has no use for civilians in wartime, and which prefers that people serve uselessly in uniform, rather than that they serve usefully in civilian clothes.
Oh dear.
All right, so that's the 1950s. The 1960s come. My grandfather goes. He's sort of kicked out in the Eisenhower years. Spends his time undermining Eisenhower. Comes back in. Comes back into the Kennedy administration. He's one of the main campaigners on the trail. And election comes. December 1960. Phone rings. My grandfather's house. It's Kennedy. It's Nitze. What do you have? I have 3 jobs for you: Undersecretary, Deputy Secretary of Defense, Undersecretary of the Treasury, National Security Advisor. How long do I have to decide? 30 seconds. Deputy Secretary of Defense. Okay. And so that seems like my grandfather's big break. But that job is taken away, as so many great opportunities in life are. And McNamara's made Secretary of Defense. McNamara's a numbers guy who people think they don't completely trust on big foreign policy pictures. So they really have Nitze, a numbers man, they don't really trust on policy issues as his deputy. So Nitze loses that job. He's pushed down the bureaucracy to the 3rd level, gradually works his way back up, and then irritates Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and pushed down in the Navy, gradually works his way back up, comes back as Deputy Secretary of Defense, and irritates Johnson, sort of pushed aside, but can't be fired, he's the only one who knows how to run the department, and that's Nitze's career through the 60s. So I now want to read a little passage about the 1970s and where the 2 men were at this point. The 1970s were the decade when everyone in Washington learned the fateful acronyms. Our silos were stocked with ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, that were armed with MIRVs, multiple independently targetable reentry vehicles. If the Soviets attacked, our best bet would be to counter with SLBMs, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, or maybe one day stop them with an anti-ballistic missile, ABM, system. Nitze had helped coin the new vocabulary, and now he would master it. He studied the weapons the way a monk studies scripture. Every word and every weapon had meaning. World peace hinged on a stable relationship between the US and Soviet arsenals. And that stability could hinge on apparently tiny details. If Moscow were allowed to build just a few more of these, with those components, and we did not counter with this, the Soviets might be tempted to start a war. He had begun his reflections on the balance of atomic weaponry in Hiroshima with the Strategic Bombing Survey, and had continued them since. Both at the beginning and at the end of the decade, he knew more about nuclear weapons than almost any other man alive. Nitze's fascinated immersion was matched by Kennan's willfully uncomprehending alienation. To him, the acronyms and details were preposterous. What could 1 or 20 or 100 more of these horrors possibly mean if we already had enough to turn the planet into Venus? In one sense, the stockpiles were all too real. In another sense, they were imaginary. For by tinkering with numbers and fretting over ratios, we created an illusion of control. The truth was that we had built something far too powerful for us to manage. Kennan did not reach back to Hiroshima. He reached back to his trip to Hamburg after World War II, when he concluded that no rational man could any longer countenance war on a grand scale, even with non-nuclear weapons. These 2 men reached these opposed conclusions from temperament and experience. Nitze had spent his youth building home telephone sets. Kennan had quietly written poetry. Nitze came to trust and believe in the power of numbers, whether in the form of Clarence Dillon's financial charts or Albert Speer's list of ball bearing factories. Kennan believed that technology destroyed more than it created. Nitze spent his life gaining confidence. He was unusually popular, generally the smartest man in the room, and always well off. From the death of his mother soon after birth, Kennan spent his life learning doubt. self-doubt, as well as doubt in the wisdom of the men making decisions for the world. Nitze's career had led him to believe that the U.S. government, especially when he was involved, could make sound decisions. Kennan felt that the U.S. government was all too likely to go astray. Nitze believed he could answer the new epic questions. Kennan believed that nobody could do so, and that the ghastly weapons were now in the saddle and riding mankind. The two men had agreed on a great deal in the previous 20 years, Korea, Eisenhower, Vietnam. But by the end of the 1970s, when nuclear weapons haunted every element of American foreign policy, Nitze and Kennan seemed to agree on nothing. Now they truly became the hawk and the dove. Now I want to read a very brief letter that Kennan sent, and it's very important. So Nitze serves under Nixon and Ford, and he fights epically with Henry Kissinger. Believes Henry Kissinger is a traitor, and fight over this and fight over that, and he's forced out. And then he decides in 1976, he says he's got one more shot. He desperately wants to be in the cabinet. And so he's, the way to get in the cabinet, one way to get in the cabinet is to find the candidate who's going to win, support him early, and then get on his good side and get a job. And so Nitze guesses right. He thinks it all through and says, this guy from Georgia, this guy, he's going to do it. Gets a Jimmy Carter for President bumper sticker, puts it on the back of his Mercedes, and starts campaigning for him very early, sends a check. And it all works out well. Carter says, Paul Nitze supports me, and it all goes wonderfully until the summer of '76, where Carter is clearly going to be the nominee. He's well ahead in the polls. And he invites 8 people to his house in Plains, Georgia. There's 8 people to talk to him about foreign policy. And they all sit in a circle, and Carter says, okay, what should I... Cy Vance is there, Harold Brown is there. They're 4 elderly people, and they're 4 young people. There's Jim Holstein, Walt Slocum. And they all go around. What do you think? All of them say, well, Mr. President, you're correct on everything. You slightly changed this policy. And then Nitze gives this lecture. He pulls out slides and says, everything you say is wrong about the Soviet Union. It's a sort of very aggressive lecture. It's completely off. Carter's, I'm the presidential candidate here, you're supposed to be my advisor, and you're just saying everything I think is wrong. And so from that moment on, Carter discards Nitze completely. I've never really been able to get into my grandfather's head. He's usually a very socially aware person, but this is just absolutely the wrong thing to do at this time. Of those 8 people who are there, 7 end up with top jobs in the administration. The top 3 jobs for the senior people, the top 4 low-level jobs for the younger people. Nitze can't be hired. Harold Brown wants to bring Nitze in as janitor in the Defense Department. And Carter says, I don't want him anywhere near the Defense Department. So my grandfather's upset. And my grandfather decides to take this out by attacking Paul Warnke, who is an old friend but somewhat of a rival. And Warnke has been given 2 jobs, head of the SALT II negotiating team and head of the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. And Nitze felt he was qualified for both too. And so Warnke's Senate confirmation hearings, Nitze just savages him. He says, Warnke is wrong. It's dishonest. Understand this. This is very tense. He's very agitated. Partly he believes we're falling behind the Soviets. We need to catch up. This is a moment of peril. And partly he's just upset. And he completely breaks with the corner. At one point, the senator from New Hampshire kind of pins him in the corner. Mr. Nitze, do I understand you correctly that are you saying you're a better American than Paul Warnke? Or do you think you're a better American than Paul Warnke? Nitze says, I do, I really do. Which is not something to say about an old friend. So this is the nadir of my grandfather's career. It's just terrible. And everybody recognizes it's terrible, including he recognizes it's terrible very quickly. It was a horrible mistake. And so over the next couple of weeks, I read through all his letters, and he's trying desperately to rebuild his reputation. He's writing these memos, sending them to friends, and he's getting a lot of harsh letters. I can't believe you said this. And it's a very low, dark moment in my grandfather's life. Probably the lowest professional moment in his life. And in that time, he gets this nice short letter. Dear Paul, we have our differences of outlook, which is not surprising. But you know I am sure that I have never questioned your complete sincerity and intellectual integrity, and that no differences of this nature affect in the slightest degree the confidence and affection I feel towards you as a friend. Sincerely, George Kennan. So it's just a beautiful letter, perfectly timed, exactly the moment. The two had worked together, they were friends, and it stayed friends, even through all these disagreements. They never criticized each other personally. And here's Kennan picking him up when he's down. It's a wonderful, wonderful letter to get at that moment. Nitze, of course, that's his way. He actually gets back into the Carter administration. I didn't know this when I wrote the book, because I didn't get the Freedom of Information Act files, but he's a consultant to the CIA through the Carter administration. So he has somewhat of a role there. And then he comes in under Reagan. He's made one of Reagan's top arms. He's the lead arms negotiator in the INF talks. He famously throws a Hail Mary pass and he's frustrated by all the orders he's been given. And says to his Soviet negotiator, hey, let's just go take a walk in the woods and sit down on this log. Figure it out. So Reagan comes down and figure out exactly how to solve these intractable problems. They come back, take it to their respective leaders, and their leaders say, give me a break. You can't break all negotiating orders and negotiate your own agreement. This is ridiculous. And so it's dashed upon the rocks. Agreement doesn't come. A few years later, Reykjavik is the climax of my grandfather's career. 79 years old, his wife is dying of emphysema. He has one last chance. And he stays up all night negotiating with the Soviets, with Marshal Akrameyev, his counterpart on the Soviet side. And they stay up throughout the night, and they start to solve problems, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock. And by 6 o'clock in the morning, they solved everything. They've reached agreements on all these things that they've been negotiating for 16 years. Things that have taken thousands of hours, resolved in minutes. And so there's this huge arms pact, and the only thing that isn't resolved is missile defense. And the question is, will the United States restrict its testing on missile defense to a laboratory for 5 years, or will it do so for 10 years? So everything is agreed to, with the exception of this small little question, which now looks like an absurd question because we could have not restricted to a laboratory at all, and it never would have worked. And a lot of people knew this at the time, and even if it did work, it would never be cost effective at the margins, as my grandfather said. It would always be more expensive to build missile defense than to build more weapons that could overwhelm your missile defense. So why do it? But I guess to the very end, and Reagan and Gorbachev are close. If they just can agree on this last little point, we'll have the epic arms deal. And Reagan comes back, should we do this? And Nitze says, yes, just agree. Others, Richard Pearl says, no, don't agree. Edelman says, no, don't agree. And Reagan doesn't agree. And so the arms deal is cast aside. And my favorite photograph that I found while researching this book is my grandfather, at the very end of Reykjavik. And there's George Shultz sitting there, there's Reagan sort of standing there, and happy. There's my grandfather. And the press conference afterwards, he starts to cry. We tried, my God, we really tried. He felt his whole life he'd been working towards this moment, and then collapses into this. And it's a very intense moment. He felt like the opportunity was missed. Of course, as we all know, it wasn't missed. And years later, the Soviet Union disappears, and it actually doesn't matter that much what happened to Reagan. And the Soviet Union disappears, and then Nitze and Kennan are hailed. Kennan's hailed as the man who foresaw what all play out and how it all end. Nitze is the man who hailed as the man who made it all operational. Kennan is asked, why did we win the Cold War? And he says, well, more or less, I came up with the right ideas and would have won them a lot sooner if you listened to me more. Nitze basically says, well, George Kennan came up with the right ideas and I made them practical. That's why we won the Cold War. But they both end, they're both praised and saluted. And I want to read one last passage, which is the very, very end of the book, and then we'll go to Q&A. In late September 2001, I visited my grandfather's home in Georgetown. As he often did, he sat in his study, leaning back deeply in an oversized easy chair. A cane rested by his side. Books were stacked on a table next to a small silver bowl of nuts and a glass of red wine. He moved slowly and had grown a light, scratchy beard. He talked infrequently and with great effort. I've often come just to sit near him and keep him company. Sometimes I would read to him. This day he started by saying how shaken he had been by the terrorist attacks on the Pentagon and the World Trade Center. I nodded, told him I agreed. After waiting a bit, I asked a question. Looking over his bookshelf, I noticed the complete works of Conrad, each conspicuously worn. How, Gramps, did you have time to read all these books when you were negotiating the arms treaties? Missiles are boring, he replied deliberately. Conrad is interesting. He then began to reflect a bit over his life. He paused for a second. Sometimes I think I had so much more luck than I deserved. That evening, I wrote down another nugget of wisdom he passed on that day. I keep going because I still find it interesting. 3 years later, in the summer of 2004, when he was 97, we had our last conversation. I came by to tell him of my engagement and plans for a wedding. I knew he was far too frail to attend. Is she kind, he asked? Yes, I replied. He came back with the last sentence he ever said to me. Tell me about her. On October 19, 2004, we let go his grip on life. Kennan gave one final public interview in 2002, when he was 98, warning that the United States should not rush into Iraq. Quote, war has a momentum of its own, and it carries you away from all thoughtful intentions when you get into it. Today, if we went into Iraq like the president would like us to do, you know where you begin. You never know where you're going to end. His body was frail, though, and he knew it was time to tie up his most important loose end. One day, he put on his coat, his tie, and told his nurse, Betsy Barrett, that he wanted to pray for his mother, who, he said, had died knowing that she would never know her son. He went to his church, spent 15 minutes on his knees. He never mentioned her again. Ken was determined to be alert for his 100th birthday. As the day neared, he tried to stay sharp by folding little pieces of paper, trying to keep track of them. But he knew he was losing control of his mind, just as his wife of more than 70 years had. Annalise was a sound body, but she could no longer remember what she had done during the day. One of the last things Barrett remembers is Kennan tenderly looking at Annalise, who he knew could no longer understand him. He wished, he said, that we could go down the steps and out through the door together. He died at age 101 on March 17, 2005, just 149 days after the death of his lifelong rival and friend.